Thanks very much, Ahmed. I appreciate those warm comments, and it's a great honor for me to be here with you. All right, well, thanks again so much for inviting me. It's great to be here with everybody and to share some thoughts. I want to first acknowledge the sultans and their representatives and say what an honor it is to be able to present before their majesties and the traditional leaders for whom I have the utmost respect. I also want to give a special thanks and appreciation for our conveners, Ahmed Yusuf Muhammad and Shefa Muhammad, for their tireless and creative work in bringing us together. My talk unfolds in four parts. First, the consequences of indigenous status for Afar people. Secondly, Ethiopia and Eritrea's treatment of Afar indigenous status. Third, recommendations for Afar to secure better futures. And fourth, I want to present and respond to some possible objections to the proposals and recommendations I'm going to make to you this morning. Let's start with indigenous status. Afar people inhabited communities in present-day Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Djibouti since at least 400 BC. These are very ancient societies, and they developed distinctive languages, economies, customary legal systems, cultures, and ways of life that endure today and are practiced today by modern Afar communities. A 500,000 Afar people reside in present-day Eritrea, about 400,000 in present-day Djibouti, and some 2 million plus Afar people reside in present-day Ethiopia. The vast majority, 91%, of Afar in the Horn countries speak the Afarinya language. The vast majority, 90%, of Afar in the Horn countries lead a pastoral life. They raise camel, cattle, goats, sheep, and donkeys in a harsh environment. Afar pastoralists have developed a self-sufficient lifestyle and economy. They make a subsistence living and a small profit. The Afar economy could and should be much larger. Afar people could and should be much richer. The reason they are not is that the Afar economy is suppressed by government discrimination. Governments underinvest in pastoral infrastructure, confiscate traditional pastoral lands, and enact a policy architecture that sucks vitality from the pastoral sector. Afar communities show all the characteristics of indigenous peoples recognized by international law: occupation of territory from time immemorial, cultural and linguistic distinctiveness, deep attachment to their lands, marginalization by colonial powers. Sébastien Gramont, now a judge of the Federal Court of Appeal in Canada, made this conclusion that Afar are indigenous in an exhaustive legal opinion, as did all the special rapporteurs who studied the Afar situation. And notably, Special Rapporteur Babacar, who is here with us, stated this conclusion in his 2023 report. It's notable because he has on other occasions worked closely with his colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples. So he is in a position to know whereof he speaks. The core of indigenous status is stated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the heart of the core is stated on this slide. It is self-determination, autonomy or self-government, and control of lands and resources. Additional rights include not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of culture, to have control of political, economic, social systems and institutions, and to have contacts with kin communities across international borders, with a corresponding obligation that states must facilitate this access. Let's consider how this plays out in Ethiopia and Eritrea. In Ethiopia, Afar enjoy self-determination and self-government through an ethno-linguistically based regional state within a federal system. Afar control executive, legislative, and judicial institutions. Afar is the working language of the Afar state government. Moreover, Afar are institutionally complete. They enjoy possession of a university, hospitals, education system, and much more. Ethiopia's system, in other words, is close to compliant with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's not perfect, but measured by the situation of indigenous peoples in Ethiopia's neighbors, Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, even Djibouti, the situation for Afar as indigenous peoples with rights recognized inside of Ethiopia is very good. In Eritrea, Afar are persecuted. More than 100,000 or 25% of the Eritrean Afar have fled Eritrea and are fleeing Eritrean persecution as we speak. Persecution is a crime against humanity, a serious one, punishable by up to life in prison. The evidence that Eritrea is persecuting the Afar is indisputable. It was reviewed by many United Nations entities. All concluded that Eritrea has been persecuting the Afar since creation of the state in 1993, and that the persecution is ongoing today. Eritrea, using violence and murder, has taken Afar traditional lands, compromised Afar culture, and threatens the Afar way of life. These conclusions of the United Nations special rapporteurs and other entities are shared by most countries of the world. The evidence for which is the overwhelming adoption of the special rapporteur's reports consistently by the United Nations Human Rights Council, where countries of the world have to vote to accept the reports. So let's just compare how Afar are doing in the two countries, a bird's eye view. In Ethiopia, the ethnic federal system is delivering to Afar communities the essence of what the United Nations DRIP requires: self-determination, self-government, protection for culture and language, and many rights. Not perfect, but the essence is being delivered. It's true that Ethiopia has many challenges. It's also true that the perfect is the enemy of the good. I think what we can say is that Afar are doing good in Ethiopia. In Eritrea, by contrast, there's nothing good for the Afar. Persecution, violence, murder, and ethnic cleansing are not good. And if we compare how Afar are doing in the two countries by other metrics, it's revealing. Ethiopia has consistently strong economic performance since 1995, excluding the years of war, averaging 8.5% GDP growth every year. The World Bank notes the country's, this is the language of the World Bank, remarkable progress in poverty reduction in the last 2 decades. The World Bank notes Ethiopia's considerable progress in human capital outcomes. And the World Bank has stated, this is its language, that Ethiopia has one of the strongest improvements globally in human development index scores in the 2000s. In Eritrea, by contrast, growth is negative. There's little to no progress in poverty reduction and no improvement in human development. Small wonder, persecution does not lead to human development improvement. I have some recommendations for this assembled body to consider. There are basically 3, and they all involve action by the government of Ethiopia. First, that Ethiopia should recognize the Afar indigenous peoples as indigenous people possessing the rights expressed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Secondly, that Ethiopia should appoint a commission to study and propose legislation to implement the United Nations Declaration progressively. And thirdly, that Ethiopia should condemn ongoing persecution of Afar indigenous peoples in Eritrea. I want to discuss with you now the most promising way for you to make this happen. My first recommendation is that you consider requesting the government of Ethiopia to sponsor a resolution in the House of People's Representatives as set out on the screen. This House recognized the indigenous rights of the Afar people as set out in the UN DRIP. Why? This will send an important signal, including across the border in Eritrea, and it will sharply differentiate Ethiopia from Eritrea. How to make this happen? The Afar sultans and traditional leaders and or their representatives are here. They could have an important role to move this agenda forward. The sultans and the traditional leaders, as you can see on this slide, have access and power. I recommend that the sultans and traditional leaders consider writing to Prime Minister Abiy to request this action. I have provided Sultan Abdu of Bidu with a proposed letter that sultans and traditional leaders can consider sending to Prime Minister Abiy. My second recommendation is to request the government of Ethiopia to propose legislation implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples progressively, as other governments have done. Article 38 of the United Nations Declaration foresees that states shall take legislative measures to implement the United Nations DRIP as recommended here. The United Nations Declaration is universally endorsed. It represents evolving international norms and moral commitments from states to uphold these rights. Important states are moving to implement the declaration by domestic legislation, using consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples focused on reconciliation, self-determination, and indigenous rights. Canada is one example. Here is a citation to Canadian legislation implementing the United Nations DRIP. But Canada is not alone. This is an advancing wave in countries around the world. Some are listed here who have gone further and have constitutional protections for indigenous rights that mirror the United Nations Declaration principles. This is an advancing wave that Ethiopia should join. My third recommendation is to request condemnation of persecution and crimes against humanity perpetrated on the Afar in Eritrea. This would be an especially important signal in the increasingly tense atmosphere between the two countries. Ethiopia has a responsibility to protect people against persecution, especially to protect kin populations who are related to the 2 million plus Afar people inside of Ethiopia, because not doing so implies trouble across the border. The resolution recommended here is a signal that various means to implement Ethiopia's responsibility to protect might become appropriate as events unfold. Well-meaning people will make some objections to the three recommendations I have proposed here. Some will say, well, Ethiopia is too fragile internally to recognize indigenous rights. There are already secessionist tendencies, and we don't want to awaken consciousness of interior nations that might pull us apart. I understand this, but I have lived through it in Canada. This is an objection that we heard when indigenous rights were recognized and affirmed in the Constitution in 1982. And so we have two generations of experience to reflect on whether or not this is a serious or worrisome objection. Was Canada too? Canada was fragile in 1982, facing a secession crisis in Quebec, and also an awakened consciousness in the indigenous peoples. Our experience has been, two generations on from doing what I recommend Ethiopia do, that we're stronger, that the secessionist tendencies are much weaker, that the indigenous peoples not only have an awakened consciousness, but a deep attachment to Canada because they see Canada as a state that protects them. A second generation is that recognizing indigenous rights will stifle Ethiopia's economic development. It will be too costly to deal with the indigenous peoples. Again, this is something we heard in 1982 in Canada when indigenous rights were constitutionally recognized and affirmed here. And it's true that the indigenous people since that time have been dialed in to resource developments. They have become part of it. And they now have an ownership stake in resource development and in the big Canada that makes it all possible. You know, I sat at the table when Ontario and Canada were proposing a giant hydroelectric dam in northwestern Ontario. And the two governments were going ahead without the participation of the indigenous people whose lands were being implicated. It was interesting for me to hear the chief of the large First Nation whose lands were implicated at that time say to the representatives of Canada and Ontario, look, you can go ahead without us. You've got the power. You don't, if you don't work with us, that's fine. Look, you know, we have many young people here and we can't control them. Some of them say they're going to blow up the dam. Where are you going to be then? I was in the room when this happened, and you know, a big chill went through it, because what would happen? Like, there would be a giant mess. There would be many injured people. There would be development would stop for generations. People wouldn't trust each other. Okay, well, that didn't happen. This First Nation was dialed in, and the dam was built with their participation. They own 25% of it. And what's the result? That area is developing. That area is much richer. The Canadians and the Ontarians who have the indigenous people there as partners are richer, more secure, better off. I think that I understand that people want to go ahead without dialing in the indigenous people, but look, we're all in it together. And if we all work together, things tend to work out much better. That's the Canadian experience. A third objection is, why risk the unknown? Why should Ethiopia do this when we don't really know what's going to come of it? Why? This is the way the world is going. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is universal. Countries are responding to Article 38. This is the advancing wave. Ethiopia should be part of the forward motion of this movement, not be criticized for failing to be just to its indigenous peoples. And it will sharply differentiate Ethiopia from the treatment of indigenous peoples across the border in Eritrea, something I think is very much in Ethiopia's interests. So let me conclude by saying that Ethiopia has shown that its power-sharing constitutional model is the correct one for development of Afar indigenous peoples. Traditional leaders should consider using their power and their access to request Ethiopia to embrace the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to propose legislation to implement it progressively, and to condemn Eritrea's persecution of Afar people. Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Magnet. That was amazing presentation. Appreciate the hard work behind this, for years of contribution to the Afar people's indigenous rights, and your work greatly appreciated by everyone.